What I want to do this week is I want to move from the logistical moment in which we find ourselves here during the 2016 presidential and United States Senate elections. I want to move to the larger tactical moment in the context of which this logistical moment arises. And that is the period following the end of the Cold War. That many of you, how many of you were born before 1992? Just one of our students. So there's a whole slew of people in the back, kind of, but there's only one of you here that were even born at the time we're talking about. And so I want to direct some attention to this today because it's hard for you to experientially sense how important that particular time was, because you have been born into the period after the Cold War. But as I pointed out in the first gathering of the class, is that virtually everyone in the generation that immediately precedes your generation, that is the famous kind of baby boomer generation, that were born actually between February 3rd of 1943 and 1945. In that particular, they started being born in that particular period, and they continued to be born all the way on to November 22nd of 1963. Another kind of primal nodal point in history, which is the assassination of President Kennedy. So that the baby boom generation was born right from the beginning of the end of World War II up to the assassination of President Kennedy. That entire period, the people born during that period were raised under the shadow of the potential threat of total thermonuclear holocaust. And all this silly stuff that you've probably heard about, at least, is being actually practicing getting under your desks in your high school and ducking your head down under the desk in case a thermonuclear bomb was dropped on you, which was preposterous on the face of it, but it was the kind of era that we were in, of constantly living under the threat of this type of danger. And it was utilized during that period by the clique of men that we're talking about to terrify everyone, to have everyone believe that they were living in imminent danger of being eliminated by the Soviet Union. And what I want to do today is I want to point out briefly, because we'll go into greater detail about it later in some later classes, but this Cold War that you hear about, history, how many of you are history majors here? One, okay. Hey Rex. And so but the bottom line is that the Cold War is usually talked about in terms of starting at the end of World War II, when the Russians and the Western allies entered into kind of agreements as to how they would invade and occupy Germany at the end of World War II, and how they would draw a line and divide up the territory to be under the sphere of influence of either the Soviet Union on the east or the Western allies on the west. But the fact is, the Cold War actually began back in October of 1917, when the Bolshevik revolution ousted the Russian Tsar, Alexander, and they ousted the Tsar and withdrew Russia from World War I, and set up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 15 separate republics, all joined together under the banner of the Soviet Union. And the Bolsheviks basically asserted that they were engaged in a process of attempting to free the people of the world from the threat of the ongoing state capitalist venture in the West of vanquishing other peoples by the Caucasians in Western Europe and the United States that were basically under the doctrine of manifest destiny and the white man's burden, have been engaged in a long period of establishing colonial imperial power through the world. And that the Soviet Union announced that it was the alternative to them. More specifically, the antipode or the antithesis to Caucasian nation-state-based imperial capitalism. So that's what started happening in October of 1917, and so as to make it clear that they didn't miss the point, the Western powers, led by the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, Robert Lansing, they mounted a foreign expeditionary force, a foreign military expeditionary force, and sent it into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. This is one of those historical events that you almost never hear anything about, because it's perfectly obvious that they are the ones that began the kind of direct military confrontation between the West and the Bolshevik Russian Socialist Party. And the Russian Socialist Party, over and above the simple rhetoric of announcing that they were offering an alternative to Caucasian nation-state-based capitalist imperialism, they ended up starting to take military steps to defend themselves against this ongoing military aggression on the part of the West. So that this Cold War that went on between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Western Allies began actually in 1917, and it continued all the way through to the eve of December 31st of 1991. And so that this was almost a 75-year period of the Cold War. And everybody who grew up during that 75-year period lived with this fundamental dialectic being proffered to them as the principal organizing principle functioning in the world, is that everything became a subset of this dialectical confrontation that was going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it was under the guise of world communism versus state capitalism. And this, as I say, went on for almost 75 years until the evening of December 31st of 1991. And so that was the end of the Cold War when President Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and signed a decree freeing each of the 15 republics to be able to, if they chose to, become an independent nation state, and were no longer bound to remain as part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And what I want to do is I want to pick up that historical moment for you because I want to explain something to you that you're never going to find out about otherwise. No matter what courses you take or almost anything that you read, you aren't going to find out about what I'm getting ready to tell you about, what happened there at the end of the Cold War. So let me point out that let's go back to 1979. Again, this is before your time, and so you don't have any kind of immediate experiential reference to kind of fix it in your mind. So it becomes a lot like, the American Civil War or World War I. Or something that is just another piece of history. But the reason I raise this is at that time I was chief counsel to the United States Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., the largest order of Catholic priests in the Catholic Church, the largest single denomination on the planet, basically, religious denomination. And the Jesuit order is the largest and most influential order in the Catholic Church. And during that period of time, I was involved in organizing the 54 major religious denominations in the United States into what they call the Washington Interreligious Staff Council, that the heads of those denominational offices in Washington, D.C. would all come together once every month and discuss what was going on as a matter of public policy in the world, and then they would try to take collectively common positions on this so they could influence the potential public policy. And one of in fact, the most serious issue of all of the various issues was the issue of thermonuclear weapons. That the Soviet Union and the United States were armed with literally thousands of warheads, and that if in fact there were the triggering of some event that led to a war between the two nation states, there was the risk of a total all-out thermonuclear exchange and the actual complete annihilation of everyone on the planet, and in fact most living things. In fact, there were lots of discussions about the only thing that might survive is cockroaches, this type of an exchange. And it would therefore take thousands, potentially thousands of years, even for the planet to recover from this type of devastation. And that the question as to whether or not life itself, living life forms, would be able to come back again was a real serious question. So you can see that this particular issue of public policy might tend to focus one's attention. And so that this was one of the major issues that we dealt with. The Washington Interreligious Staff Council in Washington, D.C. had a task force that was specifically devoted to the issue of nuclear disarmament. And we had just gotten through, in June of 1979, we had just gotten through winning a major case out in Oklahoma against the major nuclear reprocessing plant, where they were reprocessing spent nuclear fuel from the 103 private nuclear reactors around the country into 98% bomb-grade plutonium. And it turns out that we were suing the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation for the murder of Karen Silkwood, a woman who was organizing a chapter of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union there at the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Facility. And she had actually, I won't go too far astray, but in order to stop her from organizing, she was organizing union members at the coffee breaks and lunch breaks during the workday. And so the management of the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation transferred her to the midnight shift and put her on the midnight shift from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning when there was virtually no one else in the plant. So she couldn't organize people. And she took advantage of that by actually sneaking into the various offices and Xeroxing copies of files that were at the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Facility. And during that process, she actually came across and Xeroxed copies of what they call the MUF documents, missing and unaccounted for, MUF, missing and unaccounted for nuclear materials. Now, remember, what they were doing is they were taking the spent nuclear fuel from these 103 private nuclear power facilities, and they were bringing it to the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Facility in Cimarron, Oklahoma, just north of Oklahoma City, and they would take it there, it's like a metal, and they would grind it all up into a fine powder and put it into these centrifuges, and then they would centrifuge out the heavier elements of this, which were uranium, U-238, or plutonium, actually. And so that they would actually centrifuge out 98% pure bomb-grade plutonium. And then they would compress it into these little pellets, and then they would fill up these long, 6-foot-long chrome steel rods, and that they would fill them up with these things and then weld them closed, and they were sending them to the Hanford Fast Flux Test Facility in Washington State, where they were actually experimenting with trying to build a private nuclear reactor that would consume nuclear fuel and would at the same time generate electricity and the waste material that was being generated would be usable fuel for other nuclear facilities around the country. So they were basically going to use this as a means of, quote, disposing of the nuclear waste at these other facilities, process it through this plant in Oklahoma, and then generate more fuel for the fast flux test facility in Washington, and then that would generate more fuel for the 103 nuclear facilities. So this was a very serious threat to those of us who were attempting to stop the construction of nuclear power plants, because we knew that nuclear power plants were being used as a source for nuclear weapons. Because it turns out that the entire development of private nuclear power plants in the United States was just a cover for attempting to build more weapons-grade material for nuclear weapons in the United States. And we've gotten access to those documents now, the classified documents that show that at the end of World War II, when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the whole world recoiled in horror at the development of this horrendous weapon, which massacred tens of thousands of innocent civilians. And it was absolutely clear that it was a weapon that was designed to destroy civilian populations, which is a violation of the just war theory. And so that the whole world recoiled, as they had recoiled against the use of poison gas in World War I, and had outlawed the manufacture and possession of poison gas on the part of any nation state, and prohibited its possession or use. And so that there was a movement started at the end of World War World War II, to outlaw the possession of nuclear weapons. And so the United States, and there are secret classified documents that went around through the Defense Department, saying, how can we possibly figure out how to continue to do this in the face of this opposition? And they came up with a theory of pretending that they could use nuclear power to develop energy. And they would be able to make energy available that would be, quote, too cheap to meter. And that they were actually proffering to the American public the offering of free electricity, as long as the American population would go along with the development of these private nuclear facilities that were generating nuclear waste materials, that were generating plutonium, which could then be used for nuclear weapons materials. Okay? So this is what was going on. So when we were filing the lawsuit against the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation, that was this reprocessing plant for the nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel, what Karen Silkwood discovered when she was looking through the files here on her midnight shift, she discovered the MUF documents, the missing unaccounted for plutonium, and it turns out that the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility was missing 40 pounds of 98% pure bomb-grade plutonium, which was enough to make 4 weapons twice the size of those that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they were just missing these. And at first, Karen Silkwood suspected that it just was evidence of how sloppy they were. But as it turns out, they were actually smuggling this 98% bomb-grade plutonium to Israel to enable Israel to build a nuclear weapon. And at the same time, they were smuggling it to Iran to enable Iran to make a nuclear weapon under the Shah of Iran. And they were conditioning the giving of the nuclear materials to Israel upon Israel's agreeing to give a portion of that to South Africa, to the Afrikaner white supremacist government in South Africa, and to Brazil, interestingly enough. Which is, no, don't do that, dear. Okay, that what they would need nukes for is to have at strategic points, and the Western alliance is thermonuclear weapons that could be stored there and used there. And that was the plan of the Nixon administration, was to actually arm strategic allies of the Western powers to have nuclear weapons stored there. And we caught them right in the middle of that, because we discovered during our investigation that this 40 pounds of missing 98% pure bomb-grade plutonium was in fact going to Israel and Iran and South Africa and Brazil. And we confronted them with that in court, and the documents were sent to, we showed the documents to John Dingell, who was the chairman of the subcommittee of the House Commerce Committee, and he dragged the director of the Central Intelligence Agency in front of them behind closed doors and confronted them with this and proved that it was true. And what this did is it stopped the construction of all new nuclear power plants in the United States from June of 1979 up until now. And so that had just happened in June of 1979. And we then went back to Washington, D.C. I went back to the national headquarters of the Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I was organizing to try to stop the production of more nuclear warheads. And my staff person there was James Garrison, not the Jim Garrison that you'll hear about later, that was the district attorney in New Orleans that investigated the Kennedy assassination. This is Dr. James Garrison, now Dr. James Garrison, but he was my staff person on the anti-nuclear weapons policy. And he was preparing in September of 1979. The final opinion came from the court on September 22nd of 1979. And he was preparing then to go back to Cambridge in England to finish his PhD degree. And so he and I were sitting actually on the front lawn of the National Catholic Cathedral in Washington, D.C., which was right next door to where we lived. We lived in an old abandoned Catholic convent that had been abandoned for like 20 years. And we had taken that over, and our whole staff was living there. It was like out of a bad B movie kind of thing. And so we were all living there together in this big collective with our own organic garden and stuff, and we were taking on the bad guys. And so we were taking on the private nuclear industry and the nuclear weapons industry at the same time. And Jim Garrison was actually our point man on the nuclear weapons issue. And so he and I were sitting on the lawn the night that he was getting ready to leave the following morning to go back to Cambridge to finish his PhD. And he said to me, so what am I going to do? He said, I've just spent this last year working at the very cutting edge of national policy and world policy on nuclear weapons, and now I'm going back to finish writing a PhD thesis on the darkness of God under J.T. Robinson, this whole theory, theological theory. He said, I want to be, what should I continue working on? And I said, nuclear weapons. I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to organize the 54 major religious denominations in the United States to put pressure on the administration to start deconstructing some of the nuclear weapons instead of building more. And the assault talks, the strategic arms limitation talks that were going on at that time in 1979 were only designed to get the United States and the Soviet Union to agree together mutually to build fewer new ones every year. And so instead of building 100 new nuclear weapons this year, they would agree only to make 50 new ones. And so we thought that was going in the wrong direction. And so we were trying to get them to agree to stop constructing any new ones and to start deconstructing some of them that they already had. So we were going to put on the pressure to try to get the United States to unilaterally disassemble 10% of all of their nuclear warheads. That we knew that we already had almost 15 to 18% more warheads than the Soviet Union. And so we wanted the United States to take the lead by deconstructing 10% of our nuclear warheads. But it was absolutely essential. I told Jim Garrison, sitting on the lawn, I told him that the Soviet Union has to respond to this, or else we're going to look, well, I won't tell you what I thought we were going to look like, but it wasn't going to be good. So I told him so he said, look, I'll do that part. I'll do that part about the Soviet Union. And you'd have to know Jim Garrison to know that it was real. Because what he did is he ended up flying the next morning. I took him to the airport. He flew back to England to go to Cambridge. he goes in to see what do they call the person? They have ministers on the campus, chaplain. He went to see the Catholic chaplain at Cambridge University and told him who he was, what he'd been doing all during the previous year, working on nuclear weapons and stuff, and what could the chaplain do to help him. And the chaplain was kind of flummoxed by this. He didn't have any idea of how to participate on a national or global level in real policy issues because he was in a church, right? And they didn't think that was supposed to be their job. But he said, look, now that I think about it, I did meet this guy who is writing a book on nuclear weapons, and it's called The Turning Point, in which he's asserting that we're at the turning point in human history where we need to start deconstructing these nuclear weapons or we're going to inevitably destroy ourselves and all living things on the planet. And his name was Fritjof Capra. And so this chaplain introduced Jim to Fritjof Capra. Jim lays out the same thing about what he's trying to do. He's got to get the Soviet Union to respond in kind to a 10% reduction in the number of nuclear warheads that the United States and they have. And so Jim pitched this thing to Fritjof Capra, and Fritjof Capra said, well, gee, I don't know what to do, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I had been given a grant to write this book by Mrs. Rose Cruz, a very, very wealthy British woman whose husband was a brigadier general in the British military. And it turns out that her best friend, or her deceased husband's best friend, was the president of the Royal Academy of Science in England. And she said, what I'll do is I'll introduce you to the president of the Royal Academy of Science in England, and what they'll do is get each of the members of the Royal Academy of Science in England to write you a letter of introduction to their counterpart in the Soviet Academy of Science in Russia. And then I'll give you a grant for 2 years to go to Russia and see if you can do this. And so Jim, while finishing his PhD thesis and getting it published, he then started doing research on the Soviet Union and ended up writing a book called The Myth of the Soviet Threat. And so with this published book that he had now under his arm, and the grant from Mrs. Rose Cruz for 2 years' expenses in Russia, and the letters of introduction to the members of the Soviet Academy of Science, Jim gets on an airplane and flies from London to Moscow, gets out and walks into Red Square and stands there in the middle of Red Square figuring out, now what am I going to do? This is all by way of telling you that you should not ever undersell yourself as to what it is that you can do. It requires confidence, and it requires pushing forward, and it requires seeing what the opportunities are that are in front of you and trying to get yourself into places where you'll have more opportunities to do things. And so Jim Garrison is just standing there in the middle of Red Square, with his book under one arm and the letters of introduction and his thing, and a grant for 2 years. And so what he did is he started setting up meetings with the various members of the Soviet Academy of Science, with his letter of introduction to each one of them from his counterpart in the Royal Academy of Science in England, given to him by Mrs. Rose Cruz. And then he would show them the letter, and he'd tell them who he was and what he wanted to do. And he wanted to figure out how to get the Soviet Union to respond if the United States would unilaterally deconstruct 10% of its nuclear warheads. And of course, one after another would just look at him like he was totally nuts, which you have to be willing to go through if you're going to do anything like this. And they just said, I don't have the slightest idea what to do. You got to be totally nuts, and get out of here. And so he went through several of these potential people until he finally ran into one of the guys who said, I don't know what I can do, but it turns out that one of my best friends is in fact the medical doctor for Brezhnev, who was the Soviet premier. And Brezhnev is dying of cancer, so my best friend sees him every day to help take care of him. What I'll do is tell my best friend about you and see if he will tell Brezhnev that you're here and that you want to do this thing. And so he did. And Brezhnev's doctor tells him all about Jim Garrison being there. He's in the Jesuit National Headquarters. He's the best friend of Daniel Sheehan, who's the chief counsel for the Jesuits, and blah, blah, blah. And he tells this to Brezhnev's doctor. And so Brezhnev's doctor goes and tells Brezhnev about this. And so Brezhnev, who's dying, assigns his medical doctor and Jim Garrison to prepare a 3-hour, and they finance it through the Russian government, a 3-hour documentary on what all the consequences would be if one multi-warheaded United States nuclear missile landed dead center in the center of the Soviet Union. Of all the destruction that it would cause, all the contamination of the water, all the destruction of life, for 100 miles around. And they did this 3-hour documentary. And so Jim got that done, and then Brezhnev died. And so Jim is now saying, okay, now I've got to find out who the new guy is going to be and get to meet him. The new guy was Andropov. And so Andropov comes in, and so Jimmy Garrison is going around talking to everybody, trying to figure out how to get an introduction to Andropov. And he ends up talking to Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze is the foreign minister. Had been the foreign minister under Brezhnev. And he knew that Brezhnev had been wanting to push this particular issue. So Shevardnadze says to Jim Garrison, no. You don't want to talk to Andropov. You want to talk to Andropov's protege. This young guy by the name of Gorbachev, who is the Secretary of Agriculture, but also the protege in the KGB to Andropov. He says, and so he is going to be the next premier and president after Andropov, who's also dying, by the way, he says to him. And so Jimmy says, well, okay, if you'll set up the introduction, I'll go see him. So Shevardnadze sets up a meeting with Jim Garrison and Gorbachev, the mere Secretary of Agriculture, for the world to see. But in fact, the KGB protege to Andropov, the president of Russia, and he sets up the meeting, and he goes to see him in the Kremlin. And so, Jimmy, I'm sitting in one of the hot tubs down in Esalen, at the Esalen Institute, passing the doobie back and forth with Jimmy, and we're kind of just talking away, and he's telling me the story of what happened, right? And so we're sitting there in this big full moon down in Esalen, and we're just getting high and laughing and talking about this. And so he says, here's what happened. He said, I end up going over to the Kremlin to meet with him, and I walk into the Kremlin, and there's this great big gigantic door, he said. It must have been like 15 feet high, this door in the Kremlin. And I go into the door, and I come into this big room, and I look over, and here's Gorbachev, comes out of this other great big door out of this room. He comes walking in toward me, and we get right within about 6 feet from each other. And Jimmy will deny what I'm going to tell you next to this day, publicly. But I'm telling you, this is what he told me. He said, I was walking up, and I got about 6 feet away from Gorbachev, and suddenly this bright light just kind of enveloped us. This kind of almost like a dome of light enveloped both of us. And we were both just shocked at what this was. And we were standing there kind of aghast, looking at each other for like about 15 or 20 seconds, and we didn't know what to say. And so finally, we went over and we sat down on this couch, and we were both kind of stunned at what was going on, and it was still there. And Jimmy turned, and Gorbachev will speak some English in private. He will never speak English publicly. But Jimmy says to him, are you seeing what I'm seeing? He said to him, and Gorbachev said, yes, I am, but I don't know what it is, that I didn't do this. And so Jim says, well, look, I had this big speech here already. Just let me tell you this. I'm Daniel Sheehan's best friend. I was at the Jesuit headquarters for a year. Here's what we're doing. We're trying to get the unilateral cutback of the missiles, and we need to have you respond. He tells this whole thing to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev says to him, no, he says, the U.S. will never do that. He said, the U.S. will never unilaterally cut back 10% of their nuclear weapons because they need them for China. He said, that's why they have them, not for us. He says they have them for China because China can send in 1 million men into the field against any U.S. military group at all, as they demonstrated in Korea at Incheon. And he said that, therefore, the United States knows that it cannot, in fact, take on China in a traditional land war. And so they have to have their nuclear weapons. He said, so they will not unilaterally cut back these weapons, but I can. And so I will have to take this lead. I will do this when I become president, he said. But they will come for me in the night. That's what he said to him. They will come for me in the night if I do that. And so, and I will never return. You'll never see me again. He said, so what you've got to do is you've got to agree to become the president of the Gorbachev Foundation. And I will give you a set of buildings on Red Square. And you set up the Gorbachev Foundation dedicated to the elimination of nuclear weapons. And as soon as I become president, I will begin a program of trying to bring light onto all of the bad deeds of the Soviet Union and to try to restructure the Soviet Union to allow elections. And I will show all the good faith in the world. And I will start cutting back on the nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union. But you have to run the Gorbachev Foundation so that when I'm taken in the night and killed, you'll be able to continue my work. And so Jimmy Garrison agreed to do it that day and was made the president of the Gorbachev Foundation, one of my best friends from divinity school. That he was my best friend at Harvard Divinity School after I got out of law school and went back to get my degree. And so Jimmy became the president of the Gorbachev Foundation, and when Gorbachev became president in 1985, he in fact began perestroika and glasnost and began opening up the files of the Soviet Union and confronting the crimes of Stalin in Beria and the others in the Soviet Union, and began to cut back the nuclear weapons and reached out to Reagan. And in Iceland, actually, when he got to sit down with Reagan all alone, confronted Reagan and said, why don't we get rid of all of the nuclear weapons? He took the initiative. And Reagan said, that's a great idea. I think we ought to do that. And so all of Reagan's handlers, you know, who basically pointed him at the door and told him what to say as a rule, you know, they all went completely apeshit over him saying that. And they said, whoa, you can't do that. And they ended up ordering him to stop saying that. And told him he couldn't talk about that anymore, and issued all kinds of public statements that he didn't really mean it. He misunderstood the question, and so that's what happened. So they backed him away from this. But Gorbachev continued going forward with this whole process of glasnost and perestroika and cutting back on the nuclear weapons, and actually got to the point where he eventually, in 1987, got Reagan to sign an agreement on the intermediate range nuclear missiles, and signed a treaty in 1987 starting to disassemble the intermediate range nuclear missiles of both of our countries. And it was all Gorbachev who initiated that. It wasn't Reagan. It wasn't Reagan offering to build Star Wars that scared the Russians into quitting. That's all just a crock. You know, what it was Gorbachev going forward pursuant to this promise that he had made, and continued to do it, and was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. Okay? And then on December 25th of 1991, he ended up signing his own resignation to take effect on December 31st of 1991, and freeing up all 15 of the republics of the Soviet Union to become independent of the Soviet Union, completely unilaterally, you know, without any kind of reciprocity or any agreement on the part of the United States at all. And so what happened is that's on December 31st of 1991. The very following Monday morning, the first Monday in January, following the dissolution, the voluntary dissolution of the Soviet Union, what happened is in the White House, it's interesting. In the White House, what happened is Dick Cheney. Now remember, you're now in January of 1992. Okay, and in January of 1992, January 6th of 1992, that first Monday morning after New Year's, They came into the West Wing of the White House, and they held a meeting there. Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, David Addington, I. Lewis Scooter Libby, Elliot Abrams, Douglas Feith, Zameh Khalilzad, Richard Pearl, Albert Wolfstetter, Andrew Marshall, and William Crystal. They all sat and gathered and had a meeting, and they started to draft up the initial principles of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And Paul Wolfowitz was the Assistant Secretary of Defense under Dick Cheney. And all of these people were in the staff of the Defense Department under Dick Cheney. And what they did is they put together the draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, in which they proposed, in light of the fact that they were now the sole superpower on the planet, that they not respond by reducing their military budget of the United States, but that they increase the military budget so that they could forestall any possible power arising anywhere on the face of the planet that could present any type of credible challenge to the unilateral assertion of United States military power. And that they referred to this as the establishment of full spectrum dominance on the planet. And they set this forth in the document, and on March 8th of 1992, they made copies of this available to a limited number of men in the Pentagon and a limited number of members of the cabinet of George H.W. Bush. The problem is that somebody leaked it to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post on March 11th, on Saturday, March 11th of 1992, published a scathing editorial against this 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, calling it a return to the robber baron era, a return to the age of imperialism. And it was a complete outrage, but it shouldn't have been surprising, because what it was is the same power group that were running the policy of the United States in 1917, which was based on manifest destiny and the white man's burden and capitalist imperialism that dominated that entire era, all the way through the robber baron era, which we will talk about in some detail later. But they just, as soon as the Soviet Union withdrew from being the antipode to their entire Caucasian nation-state-based imperialist capitalism, that it was in fact the non-Caucasian, non-nation-state-based world communism and socialism, that they were trying to organize the antipode to the thesis or the antithesis, right out of Hegel, right out of Marx. It was the classic Hegelian dialectic that the Bolshevik Party had set itself up as the direct mirror counterpoint to Western Caucasian nation-state-based imperialist capitalism, and set themselves up as the complete opposite of that, confronting them. And it went on for the 75 years, and as soon as they abandoned the field, these guys gathered in the White House under George H.W. Bush and drafted up the entire plan to increase the U.S. military budget and establish full spectrum dominance over the entire planet. And the Washington Post took them to task on the morning of March 11th, and the following morning on Sunday in the Sunday New York Times on March 12th of 1992, they too published a major editorial characterizing this as a return to the age of imperialism, and condemned it. And so what happened is George H.W. Bush issued a public statement saying that we're not acknowledging that any such document exists. But if it did, it would only be a draft, and that there'll be additional drafts of this proposal. And what he did is he then sat down along with Colin Powell and Theodore G. Shackley, who was the director of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency under George H.W. Bush back in 1976 and 77 in the CIA, when George Bush was the director of the CIA under Gerald Ford, in that short period when Gerald Ford was president after Richard Nixon resigned over the Watergate burglary. And so he brings in Theodore G. Shackley to help draft this, and they draft up the second iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, codenamed The Projection of U.S. Military Power into the 21st Century and Beyond. And in this document, the only basic change was that this policy was not to be pursued unilaterally by the United States government. It would instead be pursued on a multilateral basis, along with Canada, Mexico, but not the regular people of Mexico, but the PRI in Mexico, which is the all-Caucasian Spanish, the Castilian Spanish dominated political party in Mexico, and the United Kingdom, and France, and Spain, and Italy, and the new reunified Germany, which had just newly been reunified. And also it said, in this projection of U.S. military power in the 21st century and beyond, it said, and also this new alliance will in fact include Russia, if they choose to join, now that Russia has spun off all of its ethnic provinces. So you say to yourself, what the hell is this? This is what I said when I saw it. Even though it was classified, I happened to have gotten a copy of it from Michael Clare, not knowing where he got it. But Michael Clare was the head of the Peace Studies Department at Hampshire College, who came into possession of both of these drafts and sent them to me at Jesuit headquarters. And I looked at this, and what it said in the second document, it said, basically, we shall not pursue this policy of full spectrum dominance unilaterally as just the United States. We will do it multilaterally with all of these countries, including Russia, now that it has spun off all of its ethnic provinces, so as to maintain, the quote, so as to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. I said to myself, what the hell is the Northern Industrial Alliance? You know, nobody's ever heard of any such thing. This was something that was being proposed by George H.W. Bush and Theodore Shackley, bringing together, in case you hadn't noticed, all of the Caucasian nations into an alliance. The very alliance that was proposed by Adolf Hitler, that wanted to have Russia and the United States and England join with him in the Great Alliance that he was proposing prior to World War II. And so this is now proposed by George H.W. Bush as his New World Order. And what I want to do is I want to back up just one moment, because now this has all taken place in January, February, March of 1992, after the Soviet Union has officially dissolved as of December 31st of 1991. But what I want to do is I want to take you back briefly to just before this, to show you what's going on right now, how this started, this crazy stuff all in the Middle East, and all of this Arab Spring and the collapse of all of these totalitarian governments that the United States and the West has been maintaining for the past 100 years. It started this way. What happened is in June of 1990, now this immediately followed the publication of an article by Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama was a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He published in June of 1989 an article in the National Interest magazine called The End of History. And I want you guys to read the pages that are in your reading assignment that are from page 73. It says to 114, but it's actually to 117. If we have to make sure we got those additional 3 pages in there. But this is actually a memorandum that I drafted up for the United States Jesuit headquarters, and that you'll be the first ones outside of our interns that have seen it. But what this is it lays out in detail for you what was going on right toward the end of the Cold War, when Francis Fukuyama in June of 1989 wrote this article in National Interest magazine in which he basically issued the warning to United States policymakers that the Soviet Union was going to be collapsing much sooner than anybody anticipated, and that it was essential that the leaders of Western civilization prepare themselves for this, because they had been promising for 150 years, they'd been promising the world that by adopting representative democracy and democratic capitalism, that you could bring great profits and prosperity and freedom to your land. But we can't do it right now because we got this problem with the Soviet Union, who is trying to take over the world. And therefore, we have to support fascists and totalitarians and torturers and other ne'er-do-wells around the world who happen to be supportive of the capitalist economic system, whether they be in El Salvador or in Germany or any other in Africa or wherever they are in the world. We have to temporarily ally ourselves with these people who are supportive of capitalism, because the Russians are going to try to take over the world and turn it into a communist concentration camp, basically. And so therefore, we haven't been able to do this. And Fukuyama said, we've been making this argument for the past 75 years, basically, but we're suddenly going to be confronted by the disappearance of this ultimate other, and we're going to be confronted with the responsibility to decide what we're going to do. And so he laid out the challenge to American policymakers in this article in June of 1989, and therefore the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush administration, was on notice that a number of thinkers were convinced that the Soviet Union was getting ready to dissolve. So what he did in June of 1990, and I want you to follow this closely, in June of 1990, this is a year, 18 months before the Soviet Union officially dissolves. What he does is in June of 1990, he starts getting this information about the fact that the Soviet Union was sort of on the brink of potentially dissolving. And he was deeply concerned that they were going to lose this ultimate other as the justification for their policies. And so what he did is he sent a memo, a personal handwritten memo from George H.W. Bush to Saddam Hussein, the dictator in Iraq. He sent it through April Gillespie, who was the United States ambassador to Iraq, and she hand-delivered this private message to Saddam Hussein, written by George H.W. Bush, the president, who, as the former CIA director back under Gerald Ford, had been one of the overseers of Saddam Hussein in supporting Saddam Hussein, in funding Saddam Hussein, and had funded him all the way from the time that he participated in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Iraq with CIA funding. And so George H.W. Bush had a certain personal trust relationship with Saddam Hussein. So he sends him this handwritten memo through April Gillespie in June of 1990, saying as follows: I realize that you have been having some trouble with Kuwait on your southern border, and that you believe that the government of Kuwait is slant drilling under your boundaries into your country and stealing Iraqi oil from your fields. And if in fact you find it necessary to resort to the use of military power against them, I just wanted you to know that I personally would not view that as contrary to the long-term best interests of the United States. Saddam Hussein, not being a complete moron, reads that document, and he assumes that it's giving him the green light to mount a military attack into Kuwait in retaliation for their, in fact, slant drilling under his border. So what he does is starts to assemble some 10,000 Iraqi military troops and assigns them to go down on and start to assemble on the border of the southern border of Iraq and the northern border of Kuwait. What happens then is Dick Cheney, his Secretary of Defense, sends a note to Prince Bandar, who is the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia. Now, I want you to remember, I want you to keep track of Saudi Arabia here, because Saudi Arabia is a complete authoritarian, dictatorial kingdom under the dictatorial rule of one family, which is the royal Saudi family. The potentate of which was Abdul Aziz. Abdul Aziz was appointed to be the potentate in Saudi Arabia by the Churchill Commission, chaired by Winston Churchill back in 1922 that I made reference to, that simply divided up all of the post-World War I Middle East into fiefdoms at the ultimate discretion of this commission, and then chose a particular single family to be in charge as the potentate in that area, on the condition that they agree to allow the oil under their territory to be developed by the Arab American Oil Corporation, Aramco. And a percentage of those profits that would be generated by the 7 oil companies of Aramco, they would give a percentage of it as royalties to the family. Not to the country, but to the family. And Abdul Aziz was the potentate designated by the Churchill Commission in 1922 to be the potentate in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And so the House of Saud was born under Abdul Aziz and his sons, Faisal, and others. And that's how it happened. And so what happened is here, now we are in 1990, in June of 1990, this memo is sent to Saddam Hussein, who then assembles his military on the northern border of Kuwait. And Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense for H.W. Bush, sends a communication to Prince Bandar, the ambassador of the United States from Saudi Arabia, from the House of Saud, and asks him to come to the White House, to the West Wing. And they have a meeting. And in that meeting is Paul Wolfowitz, David Addington, Elliott Abrams, Scooter Libby, and Douglas Feith. Same guys that were involved in drafting later the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document on full spectrum dominance. And they're in the meeting, and they meet with Prince Bandar, and Dick Cheney says to him, "We have solid intelligence data informing us that Saddam Hussein is getting ready to invade Kuwait. And he's going to overthrow the royal family in Kuwait that was also handpicked by the Churchill Commission back in 1922. He's going to oust him from power. And after they secure Kuwait, they're going to invade Saudi Arabia to overthrow the House of Saud. And what I want to do is I want to invoke an old 1972, August 1972 secret treaty that was actually put together by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon on their way back from China in their secret trip to China back in 1972 August, where they flew in the SR-71 Blackbirds, the masked planes, and they're on their way back from China. They actually stopped into Saudi Arabia, and they met with King Faisal, and at that time Crown Prince Faoud, and they met there, and they entered into a treaty agreement, pursuant to which it was agreed that they would renew the 60-year exclusive lease agreement that had been signed by Abdul Aziz back in 1922. And so even though it was ahead of time, it wasn't 1982 yet, it wasn't the full 60-year expiration of that, but Nixon and Kissinger, being strategic thinkers that they were, said, let's renew this 60-year contract so that we'll have a new 60-year exclusive lease agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we'll agree in that meeting that we will allow you to raise the price of oil from 49 cents a gallon at the pump, which it is now, to $1.49 per gallon at the pump. If you will agree that, number one, a portion of that $1 additional profit per gallon on your oil that is being sold to the that is being pumped by Aramco, that your royalties will increase by $1 a gallon. But you have to agree, as a condition of our agreeing for you to be allowed to do that, you'll have to agree, number one, to use a portion of those increased profits to buy military equipment exclusively from United States military contractors. And so they bought the AWACS airborne radar system, the Beyond the Horizon radar systems, new tanks. They started had to buy all of their military equipment from U.S. military contractors. Secondly, they had to use a portion of that extra $1 a gallon at the pump profit to dig out and dredge out a number of harbors in Saudi Arabia to be able to take U.S. warships into the harbor, and also build a number of bases to take U.S. military transports and build barracks for U.S. military troops. And then thirdly, they had to agree that if in fact either the Soviet Union or China made any feint toward invading and occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields in Saudi Arabia, they had to agree to invite the United States in to occupy those military bases and those harbors to defend the oil fields against Russia or China. And they made a similar treaty agreement in August of 1972 with the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi. And they made the agreement on that secret return in August of 1972. They renewed the 60-year exclusive lease agreements on the oil in Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they came home. And so in this meeting now, in 1990, in July, early July of 1990, that Dick Cheney is asserting to Prince Bandar that he knows now that Saddam Hussein, after invading Kuwait is going to, he says, go into Saudi Arabia and try to oust the Saudi Arabian royal family. And he offers to, if they will invite the U.S. to come in, they will protect them against Saddam Hussein. Not against China, not against Russia, but against Saddam Hussein. And to prove that his intelligence on the invasion of Kuwait is valid, shows real-time NSA photographs taken from NSA satellites, shows them to Prince Bandar of these 10,000 troops assembling on the northern border of Kuwait and the southern border of Iraq. And then on August 2nd, Saddam Hussein invades and occupies Kuwait, at which point Dick Cheney recontacts Prince Bandar and said, see, I told you so. Now you should know that our second trench of intelligence on him getting ready to come into Saudi Arabia is true. And so I would like to have you invite me to come to Saudi Arabia and meet now with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah so that I can invoke this 1972 treaty and have them invite us in. So Prince Bandar gets King Faoud to invite Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, to come in August of 1990, to come to Saudi Arabia, come to the royal palace, to sit and have a meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah. They hold that meeting. Dick Cheney makes the pitch to basically distort the original treaty that they had in 1972 into applying to Saddam Hussein, and asks to be invited in. And King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah are considering doing that after the meeting is adjourned. And the chief of security for the House of Saud, Turki bin Faisal, who is the son of the former King Faisal, who was assassinated, and when Turki bin Faisal was still just a child, and so Turki bin Faisal was too young to ascend to the throne, so Faisal's brother, younger brother, actually, King Faoud, takes the throne. And that's how Faoud ends up being the king. But he made, as soon as Turki bin Faisal became an adult, made him the chief of security for the House of Saud and for Saudi Arabia. So Turki bin Faisal comes to King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah saying, I know about the meeting. You can imagine he had the whole place wired. He's the chief of security, right? And so he says, I know about what the request is that's been made by Cheney, and what I want to do is I want you to agree not to agree to that yet. Give me an opportunity to present an alternative proposal as to how we can get to keep Saddam Hussein from invading our country and to drive him out of Kuwait. And so he agrees to set up a meeting for the next morning at 10 o'clock. And the next morning at 10 o'clock, into meet with King Faoud of Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Abdullah. In comes Turki bin Faisal, and he brings with him Khalil Mahfouz, who is the head of the Royal Saudi Family Bank, and a guy by the name of Mohammed Baroum, who is the eldest son of the richest family in Saudi Arabia, other than the House of Saud, who owns all the steel mills and concrete mills, etc., who had made billions of dollars building the military bases for the United States under this agreement that they made, and dredging out the harbors to take U.S. warships. And he comes into the meeting along with Turki bin Faisal, and the three of them sit down and they say to Crown Prince Abdullah and to King Faoud, they say, look, we've got an alternative plan as to how to keep Saddam Hussein from invading Saudi Arabia and how to drive him out of Kuwait, and here it is. And they get up and open the door, and in walks Osama bin Laden, who is the best friend since childhood of Turki bin Faisal. And in he comes to the meeting, and they propose that he, who has 10,000 Mujahideen troops sitting up at the Khyber Pass, who have just gotten through kicking the crap out of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, battle-hardened Mujahideen troops ready to go into Kuwait and kick the crap out of Saddam Hussein and drive him out of the country, and to keep him from invading Saudi Arabia, which he was never going to do to begin with. And so he spends an hour laying out plans with wall charts and the whole 9 yards to King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah as to how he will go about doing this. And then they get done with the meeting and he leaves. And Dick Cheney, finding out about this second meeting now, who's still there at the palace, asks to have a second meeting. Indeed, a third meeting now with King Fahd. And because he too probably had the place completely wired up. Because the private firm that actually represents the House of Saud and protects them is an American. And so they end up, he goes back and he says to him, look, I heard about what Faisal is proposing with this Osama bin Laden, and I tell you what we're going to do. We will sweeten our deal. Not only will we agree to come in and occupy these harbors and military bases and drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and protect you from being invaded, but we will agree, if you will invite us in, we will agree to protect you against your own people. Because you know that your people hate you. And all of these princes, these 300 Saudi princes that you have, who are whoring around Europe and losing $1 million on a cast of dice and have 16 Rolls Royces of different colors, and everybody hates them. And here are these fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, who are in fact the Shia, the Sunni, the radical Sunni fundamentalists, who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood, 200,000 members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who is exactly who we're up against in the Middle East. Not you know, the Taliban or ISIS, or I mean, it is the Muslim Brotherhood. And everybody knows it who has a political IQ above room temperature. Okay? And so the bottom line is that what Dick Cheney offers to do is to protect the House of Saud against being overthrown by their own people if they will invite them in. And so King Fahd says, that's a deal. And they make the deal, and then Dick Cheney goes back to the U.S., and H.W. Bush spends his time trying to put together a coalition of the willing, you know, and he gets like New Zealand and Australia and probably Papua New Guinea, you know, to send some additional troops. And then they set up Desert Storm, so-called the First Gulf War. And they invade. And they occupy the harbors with their warships, which they launch missiles off them, and they send in their U.S. military troops into those military bases that were built for them. And they drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, back up into Iraq. And then they follow him up into Iraq and then stop. And what Osama bin Laden had said to them in the meeting with King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah, he says, do not invite the infidels into the Holy Land. Because if you invite the infidels into the Holy Land, they will stay. And they will not leave. And they will occupy our homeland like they tried to do in the Crusades, and we'll never get them out of here. That's why you have to choose me as the option to drive Saddam Hussein back into Iraq. But King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah chose the other option. The United States comes in, drives Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq, and then stops and sets up a no-fly zone prohibiting any flights over the territory of Iraq, and has to have 250,000 United States military forces permanently based in the Holy Lands to man the no-fly zone. At which point, Osama bin Laden declares jihad against the United States and their allies to drive them out of the Holy Land, just like he told them they were going to do, and proceeds to bomb the U.S. embassies down in Africa, and they blow up the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut. They attack the USS Cole in Yemen, and they launch the first attack against the U.S. trade towers in New York. Okay? And they proceed to engage in jihad. And that is what was going on in 1992, when the Soviet Union dissolves on December 31st of 1991. And that's what's going on when, in fact, on January 6th of 1992, Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney and David Addington and all the others drafted up this full spectrum dominance war plan, basically on the part of the United States, and gets nipped in the bud doing it unilaterally. And so George H.W. Bush backs off and proposes organizing this entire multinational force in the world made up of all of the Caucasian nations of the world under the rubric of the new Northern Industrial Alliance, so as to maintain continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. Okay? And that's the policy of the New World Order of George H.W. Bush. And he goes to the elections in 1992, but lo and behold, it turns out that even though Bill Clinton, now that the Cold War is over, in November of 1992, it was over as of December 31st of 1991, and Bill Clinton comes forward as a candidate for the new, more moderate Democratic Party. No longer needing to offer the soporifics to the people to keep them from becoming socialists, because there's no more socialist revolution going on in the world. And so therefore the Democrats don't need to continue to proffer all of these benefits to people as an alternative to socialism. So what they do is they back away from the entire Franklin Roosevelt social democratic policies of 1932 to 1945. They back away from all of those and take new, more moderate positions, all articulated by Richard Gebhardt in the United States Congress in a thing called the Democratic Leadership Conference. And Bill Clinton becomes a major force as the governor of Arkansas in that coalition and runs for the presidency. And even though Bill Clinton and the new, more moderate Democratic Party collect only 43% of the popular vote in 1992, they win the election against George H.W. Bush, who garners only 38% of the popular vote. And can anybody tell me why that happened?
Ross Perot.
That's right, Ross Perot is what happened. Ross Perot, who in the last 15 minutes of our gathering together, I will tell you why he ran against him. That Ross Perot had, back during the Iran-Contra scandal, which we'll talk about at some length in a future class, during the Iran-Contra case, which we initiated out of my office, that we sued 26 members, including Theodore Shackley, the head of covert operations for George H.W. Bush, and everybody else who was associated in the private realm with George H.W. Bush, that when we filed the lawsuit against them, I was called to testify in front of the United States Congress, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on on October 15th of 1986, just a couple weeks before the 1986 elections, congressional elections. And I testified in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs, and laid out the entire operation, the off-the-shelf operation that was going on with Oliver North and all of these people. And one of the guys on the committee, from Henry Hyde from Illinois, jumped up and insisted upon turning off all the C-SPAN cameras, saying that I was divulging extremely sensitive national security information about this off-the-shelf criminal enterprise, and demanded that all the C-SPAN cameras be turned off. And when they were all turned off, it turns out Ross Perot had been watching on C-SPAN, and he saw me getting ready to testify about all of this. And so the next morning, I got up and walked out of the hearing because I wasn't going to testify behind closed doors. Bottom line is, he calls me the next morning and flies to Washington, D.C. I meet with him, fly with him to Texas. lay out the entire workings of the off-the-shelf enterprise in relationship to George H.W. Bush and his vice presidential national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, who turns out to be the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who's running the Ilopango airlift operations of the weapons to the Contras. We'll talk about this in great detail later on when we get to the issue of the Iran-Contra scandal. The bottom line is that Perot was so furious about this when he found out what they were doing. He went and met with George H.W. Bush because Perot was a member of Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisory Committee and had classified clearances and had the right to find this out, confronted George H.W. Bush, and Bush lied to him directly to his face and said that there was nothing to this, there was no off-the-shelf operation, this was all just a fabrication of the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C., and this Sheehan guy at the Jesuit headquarters, and lied to him. And Perot said, that's it. This guy does not deserve to be president again, and chose to run against him. And ran against him in the 1992 elections, took 19% of the vote, and so that Bill Clinton and these new, more moderate Democrats, garnering only 43% of the popular vote, won the election against George H.W. Bush and defeated him for a second term, therefore stopping this plan that was in place of the New World Order of George Herbert Walker Bush and Theodore Shackley of setting up the new Northern Industrial Alliance. And that's what happened. And so the way that this thing got totally destabilized by the invasion and occupation of the Middle East by George H.W. Bush and Dick Cheney back in 1991, it generated jihad. And it wasn't being run by Osama bin Laden. It was being run by the Muslim Brotherhood, 200,000 strong in the Middle East. So getting rid of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or whatever minimal iteration of or subgroup of the Muslim Brotherhood that they want to pretend they're actually coping with to suggest that they're capable of doing anything about them is a total mythology. You know, they're up against the Muslim Brotherhood that has existed for 75 years in the Middle East. And it's a huge radical Sunni fundamentalist Islamic group, and that there is no way that they can beat them. If they thought that they had trouble with the Viet Cong, back in Vietnam, they've seen nothing yet of taking on the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. And so they keep on pretending that they can do this. And so Bill Clinton comes into the White House under the rubric of this new, more moderate Democratic Party, and what's he do? He starts right out pursuing Republican agendas, one of which was NAFTA. He sets up the North American Free Trade Organization, which is a dream for the Republicans, because what it does is it gives U.S. military or U.S. contractors, corporate contractors, access to all the markets, without any tariffs, without any taxes, and sets up the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is a tribunal which is staffed by lawyers for the corporations that make determinations if one of the nation states passes a law that sets higher environmental protection standards or higher health standards for their workers or higher minimal wages for their workers, that it damages the profits of one of the other members, nation state members of NAFTA, that they can set them aside and make the government of the United States pay the additional profits that have been lost by the corporation. I mean, it's an absolute dream for the corporations. And Bill Clinton runs right in and not only establishes NAFTA and leans on everybody, the unions and everybody else, to make this happen. But in fact, he also starts disassembling virtually the entire social safety net that was put together by FDR back during the New Deal, saying that, we've gotten way lopsided on all these social programs, we have to cut them back, and we start reducing welfare payments, establishing prosecutions against welfare queens, while they're paying oil depletion allowances to all the oil companies by the millions, and all of the people on Wall Street are ripping everybody off. They're going after, under the Clinton administration, prosecuting, single mothers who take too much money in their welfare payments. So this is what we're looking at here. This is Bill Clinton. This is the new, more moderate Democratic Party of Richard Gebhardt. And in fact, that's who Hillary Clinton represents. Hillary Clinton represents this new, more moderate Democratic Party, who are basically Republicrats. That they are basically like the old liberal wing of the Republican Party used to be that as it may, but that's what they are. And so that they have struck a balance now, and so that you can be assured that the cabal, and that including the total 1%, in fact, vastly prefer to have Hillary Clinton elected president than they do Trump. Because Trump is crazy. Trump is a complete wild man, and you can't tell what he's going to do. And he's not reliable. He's not under control. If there's one thing that you can say about Hillary Clinton, is that she is under control. Under the control of all of her funders, under control of the Democratic Party leadership, under the control of the superdelegates, under control. And so therefore it's a stable passage of power from the Obama administration, who is also a classic new, more moderate Democrat, who supports the foreign policy, no matter what he had said in the campaign, supports the policy of the drones, has deported more illegal immigrants than the past 10 presidents in a row, has done virtually lots of the same things that a Republican president would do, but never could have gotten away with. And that's exactly what they're there for. And that's what Hillary Clinton is she is the person who is going to be able to continue these moderate democratic practices, which are Republican practices. And therefore it's very stable. Whereas if either Trump or Bernie Sanders were to get elected, it's going to destabilize the entire system, because the entire system is run by the transnational corporations and their financial institutions. And they operate under the theory, basically, that whatever is good for General Motors is good for America. That if you can just get more corporations getting more money and generating more profits for their stockholders and hiring more people and consuming more of the natural resources of the planet, and screw this entire idea of global climate change, just get right to it, because it's jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what they're talking about. But they don't care about the jobs. What they're talking about is profits, 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 because that's what makes it stable. And so she is the agent of stability, and therefore they're going to be supporting her. The superdelegates are going to be supporting her in the Democratic Party. The superdelegates in the Republican Party are going to be supporting her. They just don't get the vote for her. They just get the vote against Donald Trump. Okay? And now the problem is that they don't like Cruz either. And so they don't know yet whether they're going to be able to stop Trump from getting the 1,236 delegates, or 37 delegates actually, that in order to win the nomination outright. But tonight is going to be one of the contests to see if they can do it, because they're mobilizing in Wisconsin to try to beat Donald Trump by at least 10 points, so that they can pop his balloon, and that they can get everybody who's basically, Pavlovian, like tongue hanging out watching CNN, that they can in fact, oh good, now the momentum is stopped from Trump, and they can get him, so that everybody in New York will run out and vote against Trump. That's what they're trying to do right now, to stop him from getting those delegates. So there could be quite a show at the Republican convention, because Trump is not going to take this lying down. He has all of those people who have pledged their loyalty to him personally, and they're going around getting interviews now of people who are saying, if in fact he doesn't get the nomination, I'm going to go with him. I'm loyal to him no matter what, and I will support him in an independent candidacy. And that will just You know, and then the question then of the Republicans is who are they going to nominate? And the only other guy that they've got available is Cruz, who's going to get massacred by Hillary Clinton. You know, unless they were smart enough, which I don't think they're going to be, to nominate Kasich. In Kasich, they're going to have to change the rules because he hasn't won primaries in 8 states, which is one of the conditions precedent to being the nominee. So they're getting ready to change all of the rules at the Republican convention in order to stop Trump from getting the nomination. But they still don't know who they're going to pick, and so who they're probably going to pick is, what's his head, who is now the majority leader in the House. What's his name? Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is the person that they think is a stable, trustworthy person who was the vice presidential nominee under what's his head from Nevada, and so that's who they'd like to nominate. They don't want to nominate Cruz. They definitely want to stop Trump. So what they may do is go to Kasich, but Kasich, while he's polling better than Hillary, loses to Bernie Sanders. Which means, and they don't want that to happen. So they don't want to nominate Kasich and have Bernie Sanders then be able to make the argument that, look, I can beat him, and Hillary can't. Because the only argument he has right now is that I can beat Trump by more than Hillary can, but Hillary can beat Trump too. So they'll take Hillary. So the Republicans don't want to nominate Kasich because then it's going to give Bernie an argument that's going to potentially stop Hillary. So they may go to Paul Ryan. But anyway, you guys get to watch all of this, better informed than the average person.